Oh, okay, cool. Okay, guys. So in this demonstration, I am breaking down a painting by N.C. Wyeth, who's one of the Golden Age illustrators. He'll be found a couple of times, I think, in the PDF where you can choose which masterworks you'd like to work with. I studied him a lot when I was an undergrad, and I find his work really super interesting and always very well composed. So in this video, I'm going to sort of just sketch through his composition for this particular painting. And let me just look up the title again. I think it was, yes, Painting of Native American, and that was the title of it. So I'm linking a PDF in the course content page under demos, so you can just view that and see what I'm working with here. But essentially, it's sort of like thumbnailing. And I am just kind of starting out with basic sketches of the entire composition, and um, it's a little bit similar to a tonal study, which is something that we'll go over either before or after. I think after we go over composition, but so what I've done here in this video is I've listed a couple of the topics that I covered in the composition slideshow that we went over. So unity, variety, emphasis, focal point, balance, rhythm, and the rule of thirds. I didn't include the golden triangle, which is a pretty standard composition, just because I wanted to only focus on these few things, but that is definitely one of the things we went over. Anyway, I'm sort of sketching through this. The image is of a Native American man. He's in a boat, and it has all of these sort of like markings on it, these decorative markings. But what's really interesting about the composition is that it's at a diagonal, and kind of the first thing you see is this almost like this diagonal line that goes through the whole piece. And that's created by the foam that is on top of the water. So he's sitting in this boat in the water, and it has all of this pattern on it. And it's really super interesting to look at because there's a lot of variety in there. But anyway, I'll kind of break that down towards the end of the video. But one thing that I think is important when you're doing these is to, and again, you don't have to do this super in depth, but it's helpful to see patterns and local values when you do it this way. But I am blocking in just sort of general values of the pieces of this composition. So you can see I'm blocking in, there's a big reflection on the water. Because of this like cliff that is behind this man in the boat. And it's really interesting, but it's also a really important piece of the composition. So I blocked it in just with some lines and just some general value. And then you'll see in a minute, but I use the value behind the man in the boat and behind the boat itself to kind of carve out the exact shape of it. Because it is kind of complex. It's not only is it on an angle, a slight angle, it's foreshortened pretty significantly, and it's a really like, I guess the way to describe it would be sort of like swoopy, swoopy kind of design with these like smooth curves. So anyway, I would recommend, even if you do as I'm doing in this video and just sort of gently hatching, that's fine, but it's going to really help you see patterns that kind of move your eye through the piece. And one thing that I noticed that was important when I was doing this was the markings on the boat. So it's been painted in several areas with stripes and patterns and designs. And it's actually really quite beautiful if you look at the image, but they're important because they add a lot of interest to the boat itself, which otherwise could be potentially kind of boring. But I noticed that the markings were reflected in the water in some areas very strategically, because as I said, there's this long there are these long sort of strips of foam, sea foam, on the top of the water surface, and it provides a really great contrast, but it does obscure some of the reflection of the boat. So you can really clearly see the cliff reflected in the water, but the boat is somewhat obscured, but I found that these markings on it sort of anchored it in the water, so you could kind of get the gist. So I thought that was important to include those for sure. And as you can see, I'm kind of just going back in. I'm refining the shape of this man in his canoe, because I want to make sure, you know, he gets the attention he needs, because he's the focal point. So I think it's a gorgeous rendering of this really like scenic area, and everything about the composition is sort of harmonious for the most part. And but I do think that this man in the boat is this primary focus, and I'll kind of get to that in a minute. I'll explain why I think that, but I really would like you guys to do this because I think that it is it's helpful to kind of sketch these things out and notice things as you go along, because when I just look at this image, if I were to just do a visual analysis of it, I find that I think you learn so much more even if you just sketch a really basic drawing out, because I found the more I sketched, the more I looked, the harder I looked, the longer I looked, the more that I would discover. And I discovered these really sort of subtle things that Wyeth did to kind of hold your attention and also move you through the piece more effectively and almost without your knowing. So again, I just think it's really important. So as I said in the assignment, you know, I'd like you to choose 3 of these pieces, and or sorry, 3 of the pieces in the PDF that I linked under the assignments, and I believe it's titled Golden Age Illustrators Masterwork or something like that. So you can go in. There's plenty of there are plenty of topics, plenty of different illustrators featured in there, and I'd like you to kind of work through this in a similar way. And you know, I would like it to include some value because I think that it's really helpful. But again, it doesn't have to be quite as detailed as this. I know I went kind of in depth, but I would like you guys to sort of explore that. So right now I'm just kind of going back in, because when you guys look at the reference image, you'll see that that light and dark of the cliff and then the sky and this sort of like white strip that's happening through the piece is really pretty sharp. It's like a pretty stark area, and it does kind of wind through the piece, and it breaks up that otherwise maybe sort of predictable composition. So I think that if Wyeth had left, and instead, if he had left the entire cliff face in there, and he didn't break it up with that sort of like channel that's kind of creeping through these 2 faces, I think that it would have been, as I said, more predictable, less dynamic. This definitely, it cuts, I mean, this kind of white strip that's created by the sort of crevice in between these 2 cliff faces, and then the reflection of that, it cuts right through the composition. It puts a strip of white right through it, and it just makes it more interesting, and that's sort of something that I'm sure that Wyeth considered and sketched out beforehand. So just want you guys to notice things like that. And now I'm kind of looking at the reference image, and I'm gently suggesting where some of that foam is, because it really does break up a lot of the composition, and I didn't get as dark as I wanted to in this demonstration, but when you guys look at the reference image, you'll see there's this really interesting kind of massive sea foam, and I noticed that that was something that was reoccurring kind of frequently when I looked at Golden Age illustrators, is they use the foam as like sort of a device to kind of work through the canvas and to break up the monotony, right? So that's interesting, and I want you guys to take note of that if that applies to the pieces you choose. So right now I'm kind of going back in. I went back in with an 8B pencil, and I darkened up the man's hair, because I noticed it was one of the darkest, if not the darkest value in there. And even though this man is sitting largely in shadow, his hair was so dark and so long in these 2 long braids that I thought it was important to emphasize them, because that's really sort of what catches your eye about him, these 2 braids, and it kind of like leads you down his body. And I think that his face, I mean, obviously is less important in this image, because Wyeth didn't even render it. He mostly rendered him kind of looking down and mostly in shadow. So wanted to definitely at least get your attention on his head a bit. So I'm just going back and reinforcing these markings on the boat and kind of replicating them somewhat in the reflection on the water there. And I think now is where, or I'm almost at the point where I go back in and I kind of mark up this whole piece with line. Oh yeah, and I wanted to definitely get that background on the right, because there actually is like a very distinct cliff face in the background, so I wanted to get that in, and just going back in and kind of trying to replicate some of the patterns, darken up that water a little bit. I didn't really get the effect that I was going for with the sea foam on the water, but that's okay. It wasn't really supposed to be anything too major. So I was really noticing the patterns of lights and darks, and that's something that we'll talk about more in the tonal studies, but it is really important to move you through the piece. And for this, I mostly used just like the same pencil, which is one of my Blackwing pencils. They're interesting. They don't really go by like graphite hardness or blackness. They go by, I think, 3 grades. And this one is the Pearl, which is like a more balanced, hard. It's not hard, actually. It's pretty soft, dark value, but you can also get really light lights. So here I am kind of going and isolating his hair is like one of the darkest values. It's pretty much dead center, so he's the focal point. I was noticing some variety in the distance between these foam-like areas where it kind of broke up on the surface, and a lot of variation in the shapes of the foam, and that was something that kind of kept my interest, kept me wanting to look at the water, which otherwise would be sort of a boring area. I noticed the balance as well of the image, the horizontal and vertical balance. Sorry, the vertical balance. There are two types I covered in this slideshow, but I noticed the vertical balance here was really strong. You got the weight pretty much evenly distributed on the top and bottom, and the focal point like pretty much dead in the center, which it sort of doesn't assign the subject either in the top or bottom quadrant. It's just dead in the middle. So a couple of other notes. I had the dark and light tones were kind of suggesting depth, which you'll see again in the reference image. The bottom left piece of the composition was a lot darker because it was supposed to be closer to us, and then as it moves past, it's gets lighter. And then I said I noted a generally diagonal trajectory through the image, and there are lots of like things to clue you in on that fact. And diagonal is more dynamic than just a straight like composition. And one thing I noticed too, the cracks in the rocks point directly to the figure when you follow them with the pencil or with your eye. And that was really interesting. There are a lot of subtle cracks, and they always lead back to that central figure, which kind of hammers the point home. And here I just go back in, I put a grid over it, and I just note areas where the lines intersect here for the rule of thirds, and those are generally ideal places to put your subject matter. So that was the final thing I did. So hopefully this is helpful for you guys. This is what I'd like you to do for homework, and my video is going to end, so I'm going to wrap it up.